Um, just to start off with a story, a couple of years ago when we were in Australia, Shirley copied a whole lot of photographs of her family. This is a photograph of her parents' wedding. You can see her mother, obviously, with the big bouquet and the bridal veil, and her father standing just to the left of the mother in the picture, the right, of course, in reality. And then uh, she also copied a picture of Annie Matilda Pye. Fortunately, there was another better picture. This is the lady. She married a man from Falmouth in Devon, is it, or Cornwall?
Oh,
And there was no picture of him. I presume she tore them all up in dudgeon because he walked out on her and went back to Cornwall. He died in Cornwall in 1963. The reason why the marriage broke up was because the poor fellow was a drinker, not possibly an alcoholic in the full sense of the term, but he certainly drank more than was good for him. And there's hints that he may have been abusive when he was in drink. And so the marriage broke up. And as I say, he went back to Falmouth. Um, Back in 2017, that's 3 years ago, Shirley and I went down to Falmouth just to sort of look around the place and get a picture for her ancestors' home. In the main square, we saw this large Methodist church and went in because one of Shirley's ancestors was the president of the South England Conference of Methodists, but they didn't know anything about him. Then we went to another address, which is where Shirley's great aunt lived. And it was clearly an upper part of town. The houses were larger and more expensive than elsewhere in Falmouth. You can see the beautiful gardens in front of them. They were staunch Methodists, of course, and at that time the Methodists were teetotalers, and they wouldn't dream of letting a drop of alcohol pass their lips. And then about a mile away, we came to this rather smaller and less pretentious place. This was the street where her grandfather lived and died. This was a tiny little house. I think it's basically just a two up, two down house. And it's not as if he couldn't have afforded better. He was a brilliant craftsman, apparently, and a lot of the woodwork in the Australian Parliament down in Canberra was done by Shirley's grandfather. But if he hadn't spent all his money on drink, and the result was that he died alone and poor and friendless. It can't help whether you compare the two houses, but make you think of that verse in Scripture where we're told, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." And if you go contrary to what God tells you, there's the result. And then again, good understanding giveth favor, but the way of transgressors is hard. Grandfather Alexander, poor lonely old man, cut off from his family and his children, all because of demon drink. So let's talk about family trees. People are very interested in family trees. They've always been interested in tracing them, sometimes for different reasons. This chappie, Ludwig Herzog von Württemberg, he tried to trace his family back to all the kings and princes and nobles he could find in order to establish his right to rule. The Mormons, of course, love tracing their families back because they believe that if they can come across a family member who wasn't a Mormon, they can be baptized to that person, provided he's dead, of course, and then that means that you have that person as your subject in the afterlife. So if you want to become great in the afterlife, you've got to have lots of people baptized to you. Wonderful. The oldest family tree in the world is that of Confucius. His genealogy goes back 97 generations. It consists of 2 million names and fills 80 volumes of books, and it's reissued every 30 years. This is the celebrations when it was last issued. The Communist Party, or Mao Zedong, tried to ban it, but they didn't succeed, and now it's being celebrated as one of the achievements of China. Of course, here in Britain, we're used to people coming and tracking down their families. We've had people stay with us whose only interest was, no castles, no scenery. They just wanted to go to some little village and look up the church and find out something about relatives. And of course, they bring out photographs of these people in stiff Victorian poses and uncomfortable clothes. And, oh, and that's my great, yeah, well, you know. What really thrills them is if they can find some scandal associated with their family. That, you know, is really worth hunting for. I had an uncle who was rich and I think had more money than sense, and he paid a professional genealogist to trace back our family tree all the way back to William the Conqueror. But although I have this copy, I looked through it, there is no mention of a story that my aunt told me, which is that one of my ancestors was a South Seas trader and he married a Polynesian woman. Now, at that time, of course, such an alliance was very much frowned upon in polite society, but I'm delighted to think that I might have a beautiful brown-skinned damsel in my heritage somewhere. I mean, probably she was just a fat wahine shacking up with a gin-sodden trader, but you know, there you go. The Bible contains lots of genealogies. And I must admit that, well, when people are reading the Bible for the first time, I always advise them not to bother reading it because people regard it as boring. And it can get a bit boring. So why were all these genealogies included in the Bible? The first point to notice is that the Bible is not a religious book. Now that may surprise you because of course you're used to reading the Bible in church and for your devotions. The Bible is a book of history. It's only considered religious because it's a history of God's people and of God's dealing with those people. So the result is that among the historical documents, there's lots of information that is rather less relevant to a religious service. And these genealogies are part of that. Of course, they were very important back then. If you couldn't trace your family back, you might lose your job and your food supply. And we have here the example of the priests, or some priests in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, who couldn't trace their families back, and so they were excluded from the priesthood and lost out on the food from the temple. But generally speaking, you just have a whole long list of names, and they mean nothing to us, and, well, there you go. But every so often, there is a glimpse of the people behind all these names, and I want to look at a few of these interesting snippets from the genealogies. And let's start off with what we might call the longest walk. In Genesis chapter 5, one of the chapters that people often skip over, we're told altogether Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more, because God took him. That word faithfully is not actually in there. It just says Enoch walked with God. And the implication is that he carried on walking. I like the little girl who said that one day God said to Enoch, look, we're closer to my place than yours. Why not come home with me? And so they did. And Enoch liked it so much he never came back. But what a wonderful example to imitate. You know, Ezekiel wasn't, as far as we know, particularly great or good. He didn't accomplish anything significant, but he did walk with God. He was a very good friend with God. The next one I want to look at is perhaps less elevating, the world's first bigamist, a man called Lamech, not the father of Noah. Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. You might say that he had the A to Z of matrimony. Now, this, of course, was contrary to God's picture for marriage. God's plan was for a husband and wife to be so close that they were really two people in a single body, two hearts in a single body. One flesh is the term the Bible uses, and bigamy is a perversion of God's ideal. Don't worry about what the newspapers tell you. There is no room for three in a happy marriage. One husband, one wife. But we get an idea that this Lamech was not a very nice man. He was a murderer. I presume he was a hot-tempered man because he killed someone because he'd injured him. I don't know whether he'd injured him physically and it was self-defense, or whether he'd injured him by his words. or injured him in a financial deal, but whatever it was, he killed him. And then Lamech threatened divine punishment if anyone tried to be revenged for the death of this young man that he'd murdered, if anyone sought justice for the murdered man. But there's an even more interesting thing in the genealogy, and that is that although Lamech was not a very nice man, not a very moral man, his sons, Jabal, he was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. Now, perhaps that may indicate that he was a bit of a loner, didn't get on very much with other people. But his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who played stringed instruments and pipes. And Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. They were very clever boys, great inventors, great artists. You know, your background does not determine how you turn out. It may influence it, but it doesn't determine it. You choose whether to be good or bad. It's up to you. Well, there's another interesting bit in one of the genealogies, some interesting information about the name of God. We're told that Seth had a son, he named him Enosh, and at that time people began to call on the name of the Lord. Now, you know, Shirley and I, we very, very rarely call each other by name. We know each other too well. It's strangers, it's people at church that I call by name. But Shirley, you know, just hey you is quite sufficient. Oh. But now, Adam's grandsons, they were the first to call God by name, implying, I would think, that they didn't know him quite so well. They weren't such close friends as their parents and grandparents had been. However, there is another possibility. I've long been puzzled by the fact that the Sumerians, the earliest civilization, appear not to have worshipped the true God, to have had no knowledge about him. But I recently discovered that one of the gods they worshipped, or perhaps one of the chief gods they worshipped, was Enki, which means Lord of the Earth, and he was viewed as the creator god. Now, as time passed, they began to call him Ea, or Yah, and this disc shows Enhaduanna, the daughter of King Sargon, worshipping the god Ea. And interestingly, round about this same time, in the city of Ebla, there was a change made. When Ebla was excavated by the Italian called Pettinato, he found tablets that were mentioning names that we consider biblical names like David, Abraham, Nahor, Terah, even Lot. And he discovered that these names changed over time. Among other conclusions, Pettinato found a tendency among the inhabitants of Ebla, after the reign of Sargon of Akkad, to replace the name of El, king of the gods of the Canaanite pantheon, found in names such as Mikael and Ishmael, with Yah, Micaiah, Ishmaiah, all right? And of course, Yah is the name of the God whom we worship. And this explains how it was that up in the Euphrates, beside the Euphrates, you had this Balaam, the prophet, who was a prophet of Yah, the prophet of the true God, even living up in Syria. Now, I would like to think that Abraham was responsible for this, but I'm not sure. According to the Bible, Abraham and his family worshipped other gods, and it was God's revelation to Abraham that caused him to worship one God only. Well, it would be nice to think that Abraham brought the name Yah to Syria when he traveled up there to Haran with his family, his father and his brother. But that seems to be contradicted by something that God told Moses. God said to Moses, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai. But by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. And you have the mention in Genesis of when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me faithfully. Now, the name El Shaddai means the God of the mountains, the God of the wild places, which is a name very appropriate for a nomad. So I suppose, that was God revealing himself as the God of the wild places where you are wandering. But then God's name changed to Yah. Now, you may think that a bit odd, but in those days, people changed their name. In fact, I should say in those cultures, people changed their names. We're not used to that. We get a name at birth, and except in very rare circumstances, we keep it right through until it's engraved on our tombstones. But in the East, people change their names all the time. Saul changed his name to Paul. My Indian sister, when she first came to us, she had the good Muslim name of Akbari. Allahu Akbar, so she's Akbari, the feminine form of that. But when she decided to become a Christian, she changed her name, just, informed us that she was going to change her name to Salina. And we know many other Indians who did the same thing when they were baptized. So God changed his name, or the name by which he was known, from El Shaddai to Yahweh, the Creator God, the God of heaven and earth. Sometimes these genealogies have a bit of scandal, and sometimes that bit of scandal can be very useful. So we have the story in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, about how the children of Israel came out of Egypt. It says, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Okay? However, when Paul was telling the story, he said the law introduced 430 years later, 430 years after Abraham, if you read the verse in context. So Paul counted 430 years, roughly speaking, from Abraham to Sinai. Now, that can't have been the whole period in Egypt, because Abraham and his descendants lived in Canaan for 215 years. And in fact, if you look at the LXX, the Septuagint, you find that it says that the 230 years was the time that they were in Egypt and in Canaan. So both periods are incorporated in the two. Which is the correct version? Were they 430 years in Egypt, or were they 430 years from the time of Abraham to the time they left Egypt? Well, it's here that the genealogy comes in useful. These were the names of the sons of Levi. Now, Levi, of course, was the son of Jacob and went down into Egypt with his father. So he must have already been, 20 or 30 years old, maybe more, when he went down into Egypt. And Levi lived for 137 years. All right. His son, Kohath, had sons, Amram, Izhar, and Uzziel, and Kohath lived for 133 years. Amram, Levi's grandson, married his father's sister, Jochebed, who bore him Aaron and Moses. Amram lived for 137 years. Now, I presume that Amram was the eldest son, and Jochebed was very much a younger daughter, and so they were more compatible in age than you might think. But even so, it is a somewhat odd genealogy that Jochebed should marry her nephew. But when you add up the figures and the likely birth dates and so on, you find that you simply cannot get 430 years in Egypt out of these figures. So it must be that the Septuagint was correct, and the period of 430 years refers to the time of Abraham down to the time of the Exodus. So the genealogy is quite important there. Sometimes the genealogies upset our views of the way things were in Bible times. Instead of Abraham, the peaceful pastoralist, herding his sheep around the place, we get Abraham, the mercenary captain. Now, we have a rather discreditable story told in Genesis about Jacob's daughter Dinah, who ended up getting herself, well, the Bible says raped. But if you read the story and try and read between the lines, you very much get the impression that she wasn't raped, she was seduced. And but whatever it was, she had obviously gone to bed with this fellow before marriage. And her brothers were furious about it and determined to solve the problem. So they managed to persuade the men of Shechem to be circumcised, and then when the, while they were 3 days later, while they were still not in a condition to walk around freely, um, Jacob's two sons attacked and killed every last one of them, carried off all their wealth and all the women and children. It's a pity that they didn't try and convert the men of Shechem to worship the true God, which would have made intermarriage acceptable. But there you go. So they certainly did not react in a Christian way. We find that the same sort of thing, it wasn't just a one-off, this bit of violence, because Ezer and Eliad were killed by the native-born men of Gath when they went down to seize their livestock. In other words, they were doing a bit of cattle rustling. That's not the picture you get of God's people if you read the children's Sabbath school lesson. But there you go. Cattle rustlers getting a much-deserved comeuppance. And even when you go back to the time of Abraham, you find that Abraham is referred to as Abram the Hebrew. Now, usually we think of Hebrew, oh yes, that's a race. The Jews, they're Hebrews. It's sort of a synonym. But you find that this man who had escaped came and reported to Abraham, and immediately Abraham called out the 318 trained men, trained warriors, born in his household, and went in pursuit and managed to win a victory over this army from Mesopotamia. What was Abraham doing with 318 soldiers in his army? They weren't all in his household. They weren't all out herding sheep. What were they doing? Well, we get a clue from the Amana letters, where it talks about the Habiru. And in Wikipedia, we're told that Carol Redmond defines the various Apiru or Habiru as a loosely defined inferior social class composed of shifting and shifty. Did you ever think of Abraham as shifty? Population elements without secure ties to settled communities, who are referred to as outlaws, mercenaries, and slaves in ancient texts. Mind you, these Habiru, they may not have been liked, but they made themselves very useful, and from time to time you find the different kings of Palestine, even as far as Sidon, making use of the Habiru in their various struggles with one another. So the fact that Abraham could rustle up so many armed men at short notice, and also the fact that he was allied with a number of chieftains, which you find from reading Genesis, it does seem to point in the direction of him being a freebooter, a mercenary, rather than the peaceful pastoralist that you find in the children's Sabbath school lessons, in which case, here you have a picture of various prisoners. This is from Medinat Habu in Egypt, and they depict on the left a Libyan, a Nubian, a Syrian, and a Habiru. This is the Habiru. And finally on the right you have a Hittite. So this is what Abraham may have looked like. His headdress, his fancy shirt. There you go. That's what Abraham may have looked like. Abraham the Habiru. There's a more serious point to be made here in the story of the wrong wife, the story of Jacob. Now, Jacob was a bit of a dodgy character. Perhaps, he was one of those shifty ones that's referred to in the Wikipedia article. And he tried to cheat his brother out of his birthright. And the result was that he had to do a runner. He went off up to Haran, and the very first person he met was a girl called Rachel. Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. She had a good figure. And Jacob fell heavily in love with her. Went to her father and said, look, I'll work for you for 7 years without wages in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. And Laban, the uncle, agreed and said, yes, no, that's fine. When the 7 years were up, however, he cheated. Jacob breathed through those 7 years because of his great love for Rachel. But when it came to it, Laban took his daughter Leah, covered her over in veils, marched her in to the wedding chamber, the bridal chamber, and Jacob consummated the marriage. And when the morning came, sunlight came in, there's no electricity to shed light on the situation. It wasn't Rachel at all, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? Why, I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? Now, we don't know why Laban did that. He made some excuse about, oh, well, you've got to marry the older daughter off before the younger. He may have been hoping to get an extra 7 years' work out of Jacob. We just don't know. Maybe he had other plans for Rachel. But whatever it was, Jacob should have stopped and thought to himself. You know what it says in Scripture? All things God works for the good of those who love him. In all things, even in your marriage. And perhaps Jacob should have sat down and thought to himself, well, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I planned, but it's what God has allowed to happen. So maybe I should stick with it. It's interesting that if you look up the way his family life developed, you find that Leah bore 4 children. And then Rachel, finding that she hadn't given birth to any, she persuaded Jacob to go and marry her maidservant. And Leah thought, right, well, 2 can play at that game, and she gave her maidservant to Jacob, and then she went and had another 3 children. But if you look at the result, the 4 children grew up into good tribes, whereas the remaining 8 children, they were somewhat of a bad lot. If you look at the map of Israel, the map of the tribes, you find that the southern kingdom of Judah was made up of Reuben, Judah, Simeon. These were the ones who were on the whole faithful to God. The tribe of Levi, of course, was scattered throughout among them all. He didn't have any separate territory. The northern kingdom, they were the ones who went off very definitely into idolatry, and finally God had to let the Assyrians carry them off captive. If only Jacob had been satisfied with the wife he got and said, well, it may not be what I wanted, but I know that God does everything well. How different the history of Israel could have been. In the genealogies, there is at least one mistake, which may seem a bit odd. Why am I telling you about this? In Genesis chapter 11, we're told that Arphaxad lived 35 years and begat Salah. Now, have you got that clear in your mind? The line was Arphaxad the father, Salah the son. But when you look at the same genealogy in Luke, you find which was the son of Salah, which was the son of Canaan, which was the son of Arphaxad. So you have Arphaxad, Canaan, and Salah. Now, one of them is wrong. They can't both be right. Genesis is based on the Masoretic text. Luke was based on the Septuagint text. Which one was the right one? And some people, when they learn about this mistake, they get terribly upset. If you can't trust every single word in the Bible, how can you trust any of it? Well, it doesn't tell us that the Bible is untrustworthy, but what it does tell us is how the Bible was inspired. Prophecy never had its origin in the human will, but prophets, though human, spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. Now, the word carried along is a nautical word in the Greek. You find it, for example, in the story of Paul's shipwreck, where it says that when this strong wind, this storm hit the ship, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along, carried along. So the wind impelled them, but it didn't dictate their course. There's a poem that my mother was always fond of quoting to us. It's not the wind that determines where you're going. To every man there openeth a highway and a low, and every mind decideth the way his soul shall go. One ship sails east and another west by the self-same winds that blow. 'Tis the set of the sails and not the gales that tells the way we go. So the Holy Spirit impels or drives prophets to write, but it doesn't dictate them. It doesn't control them like robots. They still have a choice in what they write down. So inspiration, in this understanding, is not verbal inspiration. When God told Moses to write Genesis, he didn't say, right, now pick up your pen, you got it, dip it in the inkwell, ready? In the beginning, 3 N's, don't forget, God simply said to Moses, it would be a good idea to write down the history of the world, the history of the origin of the Jews. And then it was left up to Moses to pick his sources and write down, choose his words, and so on. And that tells us something important about the way we should interpret the Bible. We are to look not for individual words or one single verse. We're to look for continuous consistency. If the Bible throughout, from Genesis to Revelation, teaches something, and there's just one verse or one little passage that seems to contradict, don't worry about it. Follow the consistent teaching of the Bible. And it also reveals something important to us. The Bible reveals God. It's not history per se. It wouldn't pass muster in Cambridge or Oxford as history. It's not objective enough. It's there to reveal God to us. And although the Bible is historically very accurate, remarkably accurate, far more so than any other book, I wouldn't stop believing in the Bible if I did discover a genuine contradiction or a genuine mistake in it. So that little mistake, and it may not be a mistake, it's simply skipping over a generation. There's maybe other generations that have been skipped over as well. It tells us something about the way in which the Bible is inspired. Our last vignette from the genealogies is perhaps the most important of all because it tells us something about ourselves. Now, in the book of Luke, we have the genealogy of Jesus. And it goes right back to the time of Noah and says, Noah was the son of Lamech, was the son of Methuselah, who was the son of Enoch, who was the son of Jared, who was the son of Mahalaleel, who was the son of Canaan, who was the son of Enosh, who was the son of Seth, who was the son of Adam. And what comes next? Who was the son of God. The genealogy ends with the bold statement that Adam, the first man, was the son of God. Not in the same way as Jesus is the son of God, of course, but Adam did not have a human father, and especially, of course, he didn't have a subhuman father. He was created by God. Evolution teaches that we are descended or ascended, whichever way you want to look at it, from apes, from animals. We're nothing more than clever animals. Morality is what we choose to make it. And so they find themselves struggling to explain morality and why everyone agrees that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And who can tell? If there is no divine standard, well, the idea that I shouldn't commit adultery, the idea that I shouldn't sleep around, the idea that I shouldn't kill people, that's just, something that we've dreamt up ourselves. But the Bible tells us that we are the children of God, and it's God's views that are important. God has the right to command our obedience. And morality is not what we choose, it's what God sets out in his word. The Bible tells us that one day we are going to be taken to live with God, to live in our Father's house, to live in heaven. And there it will truly be important that we follow God's morality. So to close today, just remember that you can trace your genealogy back, not to William the Conqueror, but to God. You and I are sons and daughters of God.